My name is Alexis Probst, and I'm 28 years old. The night everything ended didn't start with a fight. It started with laughter, sharp, careless laughter that wasn't meant to cut, but did anyway. Look at what his ex used to get him, my boyfriend said loudly, holding up my gift like it was a joke everyone else was supposed to understand. And this is what you brought. You're embarrassing. The music kept playing, but the room went still. Conversations stalled, glasses hovered halfway to lips, and I felt the sudden weight of attention press against my skin. I stood there frozen while he smiled, like he'd just delivered a clever punchline. I had spent days choosing that gift, putting thought into it, making sure it reflected something personal rather than flashy. In that moment, none of that mattered. None. He didn't lower his voice. If anything, he leaned into it. She would never show up with something this cheap, he added, nodding toward a group of friends who avoided my eyes. Honestly, Alexis, do you even try? That was the instant it clicked. This wasn't frustration or a bad mood. This was contempt, and it wasn't new. I didn't raise my voice or defend myself. I didn't ask him to stop. I simply placed the gift back on the table, met his eyes once, and walked out of the apartment while he laughed nervously behind me like he'd won something. In the parking lot, my hands shook as I unlocked my car. Before the tears could come, before doubt had time to talk me into staying, I blocked his number and drove away. That night, my phone lit up with call after call 30 times in total, but I didn't answer a single one. To understand why I didn't turn back, you need to know how we started. We met 3 years earlier at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue. I was 25, then working as a project coordinator at a mid-sized engineering firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, and I was proud of that. He was 27, charming, ambitious, and obsessed with the idea of more money, more excitement, more status. At first, I mistook that hunger for drive. I fell hard and fast. Within months, we were inseparable, and without realizing it, I began shrinking pieces of my life to make room for his. I helped him rewrite resumes covered expenses when he wanted breathing room and told myself that supporting your partner meant sacrificing without keeping score. The comparisons started quietly. Little jokes disguised as nostalgia. Comments about how his ex-girlfriend understood ambition better, how she traveled more, how she never complained. I laughed along, even when it stung, convincing myself that confidence meant not reacting. But every joke left something behind. A question. A crack. A sense that no matter how steady I was, I would never be exciting enough to earn his respect. That night at the party wasn't an accident. It was the moment he stopped pretending to hide how he saw me. And when I chose silence over pleading, calm over chaos, I didn't realize it yet, but that decision would become the turning point of my life. After that night, people kept asking me how I stayed so calm walking out. The truth is, by then, I was already tired. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that builds when you spend years convincing yourself that small hurts don't count, because no single one feels big enough to justify leaving. Looking back, the imbalance had been there almost from the beginning. I was the one who adjusted. I rearranged work schedules, skipped conferences, and turned down opportunities that involved travel because he hated the idea of being left behind. I told myself that relationships required compromise, and this was just what commitment looked like. Meanwhile, he framed his own sacrifices as temporary inconveniences he endured. For me, even when I was the one paying most of the rent, so he could figure out his next move. The comparisons never stopped. They just evolved. Early on, they were framed as harmless memories. Later, they became benchmarks I was expected to meet. His ex-girlfriend had expensive tastes, apparently. She understood hustle culture. She dated men who took risks. Whenever I suggested we plan something within our means, saving for a trip instead of charging it, upgrading slowly instead of all at once, he'd sigh and say I thought too small. I started questioning whether stability was actually code for boring. Things shifted even more after he started spending time with a woman from work. She wasn't an ex, not officially, but she loomed in the background like a warning sign I kept refusing to read. He talked about her constantly, her confidence, her lifestyle, the way she didn't overthink things. If I asked whether he was crossing a line emotionally, he laughed it off and called me insecure. According to him, I was imagining problems because I wasn't ambitious enough to keep up. So I worked harder. I stayed late. I took on extra projects and side work, telling myself that if I could just close the gap, he kept pointing out things would settle. But the more I gave, the more entitled he became to my effort. Appreciation disappeared, replaced by expectation. If dinner wasn't ready, he complained. If I was too tired to go out, he accused me of killing the mood. And if I tried to explain how small his comments made me feel, he flipped it around and said I was holding him back with my sensitivity. There were nights I lay awake next to him, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations, and wondering when love had turned into something I had to constantly prove. I remembered one evening clearly I had skipped a networking event to help him prepare for an interview, quizzing him late into the night. He got the job. Instead of celebrating with me, he went out with coworkers and didn't come home until after 2 in the morning. When I asked if he could have at least texted, he brushed me off and said, "This is how successful people live. You wouldn't get it." That was when I first felt like a placeholder, useful, dependable, but ultimately replaceable. Still, I stayed. I told myself loyalty meant endurance. I told myself love wasn't supposed to be easy. What I didn't realize was that I was slowly training myself to accept disrespect as normal. By the time his humiliation at the party happened, the ground had already been eroding beneath my feet for years. I just hadn't wanted to look down. The days after the party passed in an eerie quiet. There was no dramatic fallout, no public argument, no friends choosing sides in group chats. I didn't post anything online. I didn't send long messages explaining my feelings or demanding closure. I simply disappeared from his life as completely as I could manage. For the first week, I stayed with a friend across town. Her spare bedroom smelled like laundry detergent and unfamiliar walls, and at night I lay awake listening to traffic, replaying moments I had ignored for too long. My phone stayed face down on the nightstand. Even blocked his attempts found their way through emails from new addresses, messages sent through mutual friends who said he was worried, confused, hurt. I didn't respond, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I finally understood that engaging would only pull me back into a cycle I had barely escaped. When I returned to our apartment to collect my things, I did it while he was at work. I packed efficiently, like someone closing out a chapter instead of mourning it. Clothes, books, a few framed photos I couldn't quite bring myself to throw away yet. I left the rest behind. The lease was in my name, and I notified the landlord that I'd be moving out at the end of the month. No note. No explanation. He had already said everything he needed to say at that party. I found a small studio on the quieter edge of the city. It wasn't impressive, but it was mine. There were no memories attached to the walls, no echoes of criticism lingering in the corners. The first night I slept there, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. I cried not because I missed him, but because I was finally allowing myself to acknowledge how lonely I had been even while sharing a bed with someone. I threw myself into work. Projects I'd postponed suddenly felt manageable without the constant emotional drain waiting for me at home. Within a month, my manager pulled me aside and told me my focus hadn't gone unnoticed. A promotion followed shortly after, along with a raise that made me realize how much I'd underestimated my own trajectory while trying to support someone else's. The silence seemed to unsettle him more than any confrontation could have. He tried calling from private numbers, then from friends' phones. Messages filtered back to me secondhand. He didn't understand how I could be so cold, so unbothered. He told people I was overreacting, that it had just been a joke, that I was throwing everything away over one bad night. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so familiar. Minimizing my pain had always been his favorite defense. I didn't correct the narrative. I didn't defend myself. I let the quiet speak for me. I started going to the gym again, not to prove anything, but because movement helped bleed the tension out of my body. On weekends, I hiked trails he'd once mocked as boring, finding peace in the steady rhythm of my own footsteps. Old friends drifted back into my life once I stopped canceling plans to accommodate him, and I realized how much of my world I had put on hold. Rebuilding wasn't dramatic. It was slow and almost dull in its consistency. But with every day that passed, I felt a little lighter. The absence of his voice criticizing, comparing, demanding felt like oxygen. And while I didn't know it yet, his life was beginning to unravel in ways that would soon make my silence impossible for him to ignore. I didn't find out about his downfall right away. Life had started moving forward again, and I wasn't looking back often enough to notice the cracks forming behind me. The details came later, filtered through mutual friends who couldn't help themselves. Little pieces of information delivered with lowered voices and hesitant glances, as if they were unsure whether I wanted to hear any of it at all. The image he had been chasing, the fast life, the impressive connections, the effortless success, turned out to be built on nothing solid. The woman from work he'd so casually held up as an example of everything I wasn't had been less of a dream and more of a distraction. Their relationship, if it could even be called that, unraveled quickly once it stopped being exciting. Office rumors turned into uncomfortable meetings, and uncomfortable meetings turned into formal warnings. What he had framed as ambition began to look a lot like recklessness. Money problems surfaced next. The lifestyle he'd been trying to project was far more expensive than he'd let on. Credit cards, maxed out payments, missed quiet calls to friends asking for temporary help. The confidence he'd worn so easily started slipping, replaced by irritation and blame. According to people who still spoke to him, he couldn't understand how things had gone wrong so fast. He was convinced someone else was responsible: his job, his coworkers' bad timing, never his choices. As his world narrowed, his attempts to reach me intensified. The messages shifted tone, cycling through apology, anger, nostalgia, and entitlement. One email stood out enough that I read it all the way through before deleting it. He wrote about how much pressure he'd been under, how I'd always been the stable one, the person who held everything together. He said he missed that. He said he missed me. What struck me wasn't the sentiment, it was the framing. Even in regret, I was still being cast as a resource he'd lost, not a person he'd hurt. Friends who had once laughed at his jokes began distancing themselves. Invitations dried up. The same people who had stayed silent during his public humiliation of me now seemed uncomfortable around him, as if the confidence they admired had turned sour. I was told he complained about me often, about how I'd abandoned him when he needed support. Hearing that didn't sting the way it might have once. It only confirmed what I'd already accepted: he had never really seen me outside of what I provided. I didn't feel triumphant hearing all this. There was no rush of vindication, no sense of justice served. If anything, I felt oddly detached, like I was listening to a story about someone I used to know a lifetime ago. The life I was building no longer had space for his chaos, and that realization was more satisfying than any apology could have been. By then, I had started seeing someone new, not seriously at first. Just coffee-long walks, conversations that didn't feel like tests I could fail. He listened without comparing, asked questions without judgment, and never once made me feel like I needed to earn my place beside him. The contrast was stark, and it made me realize how normalized my discomfort had become in my previous relationship. Still, I had no idea that my ex wasn't done trying, and that soon he would force one last confrontation, hoping to reclaim what he'd thrown away. By the time he found a way to corner me, I had almost forgotten what it felt like to brace myself around him. Life had settled into something steady and honest. My days were full, my nights calm, and the constant undercurrent of anxiety I used to carry had faded so gradually I hadn't noticed when it disappeared. I wasn't healed in some dramatic cinematic sense, but I was no longer bleeding. The confrontation happened at a mutual friend's wedding months after the party where everything had ended. I considered not going, but the idea of skipping milestones out of fear felt like letting the past keep its grip on me. So I went. I arrived dressed, simply confident in a way I hadn't been before, with a man beside me who treated my presence like something valuable rather than convenient. He spotted me almost immediately. I saw the recognition hit him before he reached me. The surprise, the calculation, the sudden urgency. He waited until I was alone near the bar before stepping into my space, his voice dropping into something meant to sound sincere. He told me he'd hit rock bottom, that everything had fallen apart, that he finally understood what he'd lost. As he spoke, I noticed how different he looked. The sharp edges of his confidence were gone, replaced by desperation he couldn't quite mask. He talked about stress, bad influences, mistakes, about how I had always been his anchor. He asked if we could talk privately, if I could just hear him out. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him calmly that I hoped he figured things out, but that I wasn't part of that process anymore. I reminded him without anger that what ended us wasn't a misunderstanding or a bad night. It was a pattern, a choice he made over and over until I finally stopped accepting it. His expression hardened. The apology cracked, revealing frustration underneath. He said I was being cold, that I was throwing away history for something new and shiny. He glanced toward the man waiting for me, then sneered that I'd see the truth eventually, that I'd regret this when the novelty wore off. That was the moment I knew there was nothing left to say. I told him goodbye and walked back to my seat without looking back. I felt no urge to check whether he was watching, no satisfaction in his defeat. Just relief. The door I'd closed months ago finally locked. Later that night, as I laughed with people who knew me, without diminishing me, I understood something I wish I'd learned sooner. Walking away quietly is sometimes the loudest statement you can make. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need validation. I needed peace, and I had it. I used to think closure was a conversation, an apology delivered the right way at the right time with enough remorse to finally make the hurt feel justified. I know better now. Closure is something you give yourself the moment you stop waiting for someone else to understand what they did to you. After that wedding, I never saw him again. There were no surprise emails, no late-night messages from unfamiliar numbers, no mutual friends hinting that he was doing better or still talking about me. Whether he finally accepted the reality of losing me or simply found another distraction didn't matter. He had faded into a background character in a life that no longer revolved around him. What surprised me most was how ordinary happiness turned out to be. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive all at once. It showed up quietly in mornings where I didn't feel tension in my chest before opening my eyes in conversations where I wasn't measuring my words to avoid triggering defensiveness in plans that didn't require negotiation or justification. I realized how much emotional labor I'd been performing just to keep a relationship afloat and how unnatural that had been all along. The man I was seeing didn't try to rescue me or rewrite my past. He didn't need to be impressed by what I endured. He simply showed up consistently respectfully without keeping score. When I talked about work, he listened without comparing me to anyone else. When I needed space, he gave it without turning it into a punishment. It felt unfamiliar at first, almost suspicious until I understood that calm wasn't a warning sign. It was what safety actually felt like. Professionally, things continued to grow. Opportunities I would have once turned down out of guilt or fear became possibilities I allowed myself to explore. I traveled. I spoke up more in meetings. I stopped shrinking to make room for someone else's ego. Confidence followed naturally, not the loud performative kind, but the steady assurance that comes from knowing you can walk away from what disrespects you. Every now and then, someone would mention him in passing, a comment about how he hadn't really bounced back, or how he always talked about what he lost. I never asked for details. The version of me who needed to know had already healed. The rest felt like information from a story I'd finished reading. If there's one thing I wish I could tell the woman I was before that night at the party, it's this: love doesn't require humiliation to prove devotion. Loyalty isn't staying when you're being diminished. And silence when chosen intentionally is not weakness, it's clarity. Walking away without begging, without explaining myself into exhaustion, without fighting for someone who had already decided I wasn't enough, that choice didn't